So thanks for everyone waiting for my presentation. I'm Francis, and in this recording, I present the paper, which is called Learning to Interpretation from Object Representation for Deep Reinforcement Learning. Various work have already shown that deep neural networks let reinforcement learning agents to achieve human-level control by modeling action value functions. As a result, we can see DQN agents which outperform human players in a number of games, including but not limited to Go, chess, StarCraft, and so on. However, the traditional agents which rely on such combination of fully connected networks for processing inputs does not lend itself to the easy and clear understanding of the decision-making process. On the other hand, recently as the EU's General Data Protection Regulation did, governments or international organizations began asking the algorithm to explain to users how a decision was made. So not only to comply with such regulations, but also to enhance trust as well as the performance of models, we would like to interpret or explain the decision was created by our models and answer to the questions such as how important is each input feature? How does it actually influence the agent's decisions? And what and how much did an agent learn from each input? Most of previous works on DRL interpretations focus on visualizing the feature importance based on the low-level, high-dimensional input space such as an image. However, the issue is that the resultant interpretations are usually point-wise and hardly reveals a global causal relationship between these inputs and our predictions. A famous alternative is to build transparent trees which mimic the black box DLL model. But if a tree ends up with too many splits, we may not get it, no matter how accurate a decision is. If we limit the complexity, we should take the risk of the unsatisfactory performance. So the main idea of this paper is first to learn the compressed hidden features as the best representation of the raw inputs, and then to find the simplest mimic tree based on those features, thereby balancing both faithfulness or fidelity and simplicity according to the information bottleneck principle in the information theory. Before we move on to discussing the model, we should begin with what interpretability actually means in the context of this work. Murdoch and others on their paper on interpretable machine learning defines interpretability as the extraction of relevant knowledge from machine learning model concerning relationships either contained in data or learned by the model. Then, a good interpretable model has the following characteristics. Here, the term accuracy is not limited to the practical accuracy or extend how our model approximates the truth well. We also need to consider descriptive accuracy or fidelity as called in this paper, evaluating whether the interpretation is a perfect or truthful representation of the truths done by our model. Because the audience of the interpretation varies from doctors, engineers, politicians, economics, and others, we want to have the interpretations provide relevant insight to the chosen domain problem. Of course, it's always not enough to emphasize the need of a simple and consistent interpretation given a single data. The model of the interpretation can be classified as either post hoc, where we explain the decision rules after the original model learns them, or intrinsic, such that we replace the original black box model with a transparent alternative such as linear model or decision tree. The scope of interpretation is local on each individual prediction given a specific input, or global on the entire data set. We can deliver the interpretations by means of visualization, text, mathematical expressions, and even their combinations. The following two examples represent the visualized attention maps and a saliency map. The bottom row in the left image shows a sequence of state action pairs masked by the interpretable attention masks. The opponent's position and the net in tennis game are emphasized in bright areas, and the mask policy uses them to take the next actions. The Pac-Man example on the right side actually implies the agent which is not really successful because it doesn't recognize the monster. So in this case, the interpretation through this saliency map even helps us debugging the code as well. Nonetheless, as mentioned in the introduction, the identifiability of attention distributions is not ensured for different local samples, and the visualized interpretations are pointwise on each individual pixel and cannot deliver the underlying causal relations. To reveal the global relationship, Bai and Karana suggest that a shallow neural network can learn complex functions as good as a deeper counterpart. In DLL, there were works on the approximation of Q functions using linear trees, which is the most famous example of transparent and intrinsically interpretable models. However, given the linear structure, we are likely to find the resulting interpretations too complicated to understand because there are too many nibs. Then the dilemma is that if we control the complexity of our approximating model, we are not really sure whether the predictive accuracy is high enough. The information bottleneck principle, or IB, we want to follow is very simple. We want to find the sweet spot between descriptive accuracy and simplicity and find the mimic learner which best preserves both the target information and conciseness of the compressed input data. However, we again face the issue that first, the raw inputs such as images or genetic data are entangled and high dimensional. So our model may not learn the raw inputs X. In the R context, we will define the inputs X as the state action reverse triplets. A solution is to learn a latent representation Z, which we define as a vector, a capital D-dimensional vector, and then we build the mimic learner called phi upon this latent vector Z. The second issue is that given such characteristics of the raw inputs, the marginal probability of Z of X and therefore the posterior of Z given X are both intractable in practice. That's why we also need to utilize the framework of variational approximation, and our model will learn the approximate posteriors. The framework named represent and mimic, or REM in short, separately interprets input features with their interpretable latent representations and decision rules with a transparent mimic tree. In other words, the knowledge of a DLL model is distilled to a mimic tree, which will learn the post hoc interpretation. The target we want to mimic is action advantage values defined as the difference between Q and value functions. The mimic learner will let us understand when an action outperforms others by the amount of Y. And by theorem proved in the appendix of this paper, to have a such model, which is both speed up and simple, we should maximize the lower bound of the following function, which is the sum of evidence lower bound, minimum description length, and the entropy regularizer. Now introduce the identifiable multi-object network, or IMONET in short. It adopts variational autoencoders, or VAE. We need to approximate the posterior, which is intractable in most of the cases through variational approximation. We call the lowercase q as such approximation of its corresponding p, which refers to a true distribution. Then the approximate posterior, q of z given x, encodes the raw inputs x. We sample the latent variable z from this approximate posterior and then project them to inputs by utilizing a state decoder or the likelihood function. Then, as a result, the reconstruction is made as theta of x, which are now our outputs. In our IMONET, unlike the original VA framework, we assume the independence of the latent features in Z during computation. This is as important as the first apparent I in our model states, because the independence is indispensable to obtaining a disentangled and identifiable latent variable, thereby allowing us to model the causal relations transparently between latent variables and targets. I'll explain further about the interpretation of the latent variables in the experiment sections. Lastly, we can note that a good approximation of posterior minimizes its Kullback liabilities divergence from the unknown prior of Z. That is, given the IB objective function given in theorem 1, page 3 of the paper, we then actually maximize the evidence lower bound and therefore fidelity. As the name suggests, the learning process happens in a larger structure called multi-object network or MONE. Here we decompose a state into case-separate pieces by masking it through the attention network. Then we use the VAE, but now we condition the mask state on not only the masks themselves, then not only the mask, but also on action and reward in our raw inputs. Then we employ the factor prior latent Z condition on action and reward. In the MONE, we reconstruct not only the mask states, but also the attention masks themselves through the VA framework by approximating the posterior of the case mask given state action reward triplets and computing the Kullback library divergence from the state decoder or the likelihood of the mask for case object given latent variable Z. Now, Monte Carlo regression tree search algorithm minimizes the minimum description length in our objective function. After we extract the latent variable Zi from the ith data points, we construct the triplets of Z, action, and rewards as inputs and save them at the root node. We partition the saved data points in a parent node by a split called F to two cells in child nodes. By recording the number of visits and the Monte Carlo estimate of Q function at the split F, the tree search algorithm learns a compact posterior distribution capital Phi, or the collection of the mimic trees given the latent variable Z. The diagram shows that when the tree search constructs a search tree, an edge of this search tree corresponds to the split F in the chosen mimic tree as optimal. The implementation goes as follows. First, we run M plays from a starting node. At each M's play and the else layer, we select the split. We select the split that maximizes the upper confidence bound or the augmented estimate of the Q functions. Here we augment the previous estimate more for less visited nodes and control the exploration with a constant C. Then we evaluate the selected lib node with the Monte Carlo estimate of the reward. Expand the lib with the children nodes. Then update the Q function, and lastly we move or select the split with the highest number of visits and set the starting node to the connected child. For empirical evaluation, the paper refers to three environments. First, the famous space invaders and assault, where reward one is given for every kill. And the Flappy Bird, where reward 0.1 counts for every time step, and the pillars, which construct the states, are randomly generated. Here, we reward 1 for the Flappy Bird, reward +1 for passing each pillar, and when the bird hit either a pillar or the ground, the game is over with the reward -1. We train a DRL agent for each environment using DQN for Flappy Bird and H3C algorithm for the other two, and collect the state action reward triplets with their corresponding target values, where an epsilon greedy with epsilon equal to 0.01 select actions and the traverse states. There are 5 baseline models as listed there, which will perform mimic learning with the raw input data. And we will see how their performance improves based on the latent representation learned by various autoencoder and IMONET. Regarding how to interpret latent representation, we will traverse the latent features. That means we average all the latent features of the sample images generated by the IMONet, then traverse each these latent feature in the case object from its maximum to minimum values, having the other k times d minus 1 features fixed. The image describes the interpretation and decision-making process for a session of a Flappy game. Each of the three attention masks is for the background, pillars, and the bird, as the white area in each block indicate the captured object. The last four columns shows the traversal of the first variable for the third object, which is bird, and of the third latent variable for the second object, which is pillar. As the first latent variable increases, the bird stays close to the lower pillars. And if the second one increases, the length of the upper left pillar decreases. So in terms of the overall variance reduction, the combination of IMONet and the Monte Carlo regression tree search dominates, with a significantly fewer number of leaves in the selected tree. And the combination of the object representation learned by IMONet outperformed others thanks to the identifiability of the latent features. And the tree search consider the tree's performance at the global level and can maintain the simple mimic tree's fidelity. Some trees, of course, we see some trees built from raw inputs which outperforms in terms of other metrics such as the root mean squared error, but their size is far larger than our model. If we compare the variance reduction per leaf of the baseline methods, definitely the Monte Carlo, the regression tree search dominates given the same number of leaves. If we the Monte Carlo tree search looks ahead to the future cumulative rewards instead of local influence, and we see that the selected split is well explored and therefore more efficient than a greedy one with extra linear regressors at leaf nodes. And as for the identifiability, we have the mean correlation coefficients for MCC for the extensions for the vanilla variation encoders and its extensions, including IMONets. As time goes by, the IMONet, which is denoted as IDOE in the previous version of this paper, outperforms the vanilla VAE and the other extensions, and we can conclude that the MCC measures the conditioning variables, which is action and reward, and an object network together further improve the identifiability of latent features. Lastly, when we look at the resultant regression tree, these visualizations capture the difference of object information after splitting. Recalling from the previous slides, the first variable for the bird is negatively proportional to distance between the bird and the upper left pillar. The advantage of the action going down is maximized. This causal relation is again verified by sampling separate data points from the child nodes. Our mimic tree also enables us to perform counterfactual analysis if the bird is far enough from the upper pillar, which we set the mentioned latent variable as 0, then the advantage decreases, and this analysis further enhances the causal relations. In conclusion, we are referring to the information bottleneck principles. The author developed a framework which jointly optimized the fidelity and the simplicity of the mimic tree. especially utilizing the conditional extension of the variational autoencoder, IMONET converts state features into an identifiable latent representation, which captures the independent factors of variation for the masked object. And moreover, the Monte Carlo regression tree search learns a compact distribution over the collection of the mimic trees and decrease the complexity of the optimal tree, which minimize the minimum description length. The first limitation is that the nature of the Monte Carlo tree search, which conducts multiple simulations for searching the optimal tree many times, lead to the increasing computational costs. And lastly, the empirical evaluation involve the illustrated examples and human evaluations. On the other hand, it's because on the other hand, it's generally hard to theoretically justify or quantify the level of the interpretability. This is the end of my presentation, and everyone, thanks for watching till the end.